from the CyberHub bunker and studio, you're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast. And now for your host and CISO, James Azar.
So how many of you are watching the show at San Francisco International right now? On your way home from RSA, and someone told you take the early flight out. What do you got to lose? Sitting at the Delta Lounge or United Lounge, and they're like, oh, look, it's Chris and James on a Friday. What's happening, gang? What's going on, Chris?
It's been a while, man. How was vacation?
Vacation was amazing. I'm rejuvenated. I'm excited to be back and at it. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. Happy Friday. It is Friday. It's Mother's Day weekend. So for everyone married who has a wife or a partner and celebrates Mother's Day, and everyone here has a mom, do yourself a favor. Send mom some chocolates or flowers. Take her out to a nice brunch or lunch. Spend some time on Sunday with your creator, your mother, and enjoy that.
Absolutely.
Right?
Rejoice.
We're talking cyber resilience today. I want to get right to it because we've got 30 minutes. I want to be brass tacks, if it makes sense.
So, James, when you think of cyber resilience, what are some of the minimum things you need for an organization to truly be resilient?
So to me, I'm going to approach this two different ways. I'm going to go framework wise, and then I'm going to go really brass tacks. So framework wise, I look at the CIS top 20, and I go, if I took the top 10, I create a hardened, resilient network, right?
Yep.
And then if I look at those top 10 and I go, what are the must do's? It's stuff that you and I were talking about earlier: MFA, IM, data visibility and processing, backups. Those are the ones that really stick to me, kind of top of mind. Security culture, awareness, not part of the CIS top 20 there, right? That might be the only one that's kind of outside of that, but the human element is
you can't forget the human element, because oftentimes you can create all these policies, all these frameworks, all these controls, but if people don't understand the why behind it, you're going to find a reason to go around it. If they don't understand why they should enable MFA, or why they should separate their identities from work to home, or use different passwords so that if their social media account gets hacked, their work account doesn't get hacked. And then from an IM perspective, you want to make sure that James doesn't have access to the PCI information if he doesn't need it. Keep it separate. Only give people the access that they need.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go a step further with this brass tacks. When you look at all your users in your organization, right, and you define your users based on, I've got a guy, or I've got a person here, an employee here who has admin access. So anyone with admin access to anything critical to me goes up a level in terms of cyber protection, right?
Absolutely.
And one of the things I like to do as a CISO is I like to add them as part of our threat intel service. So if I want to get your personal email from HR or from you as an individual, and I want to monitor it, and I'm only monitoring it for leaks, and I don't want you reusing passwords. And the reason we do that is because in most cases, and this is a very, very true fact, it's something we don't often talk about, but it's absolutely true. Most people use the same password for their personal accounts that they use for their business accounts. And we know threat actors and initial access brokers strive off of that. They know that if they can compromise your 23andMe account, that they can go and compromise your work account, and Active Directory is next. And so I like to monitor those. That's one way to manage IM, kind of brass tacks. Anyone with admin access, anyone who's getting access to prod, who's able to push updates in, that's got access to the GitHub repos. You want to monitor their GitHub emails as well, because in most cases, people have multiple identities in GitHub because they're working on a company project, but then they've also got other side projects they're contributing to or managing or running. And you want to be able to manage both and make sure that you, and protecting your employee outside of work this way adds value to the employee as well, especially if you explain it. like you so eloquently said early on.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've worked with a recent organization that they do is they're using 1Password. And 1Password has the potential to separate vaults from work identities to personal identities. And then it allows them to easily create different passwords that they don't even need to know. They could just copy, paste, put it in there, and they're then able to better control their identity. Plus, it has the ability to do MFA right then and there. So it provides all these controls in a simple to use framework that you're creating strong password management, separate identities, as well as providing them with a personal service to take this great identity management and put it in their personal life so that they're not going to suffer from that. Because, I mean, if I suffered from a data breach in my personal life, it will affect my work life. Like if my bank was being drained, if people were putting out a mortgage in my name, like that would affect my ability to focus on work. So providing this service, providing them with this opportunity to separate their identities costs not much more for the organization, but provides that much more protection.
Yeah, for everyone tuning in, if you have questions or comments, please put them let us know. If you've got feedback, there's stuff you want us to answer for you, we'll do that. I by the way, I completely agree with the approach of we want to try and do as much for our employees as part of cyber as we would for anyone, and not just the people with admin access, right? I think there's an aspect to that, but then there's the cost piece to it as well. And
Yes.
so there's a little bit of both. But I think the big one thing I noticed in the Verizon DBIR report, right? The amount of employee data that was compromised in 2023 by meaning companies whose victims weren't customers but employees,
Yep.
was higher than all 4 years before. So take that with a grain of salt. Take that however you want to see it. To me, that's telling that as an employer, your employee information, your employees' payroll information, their livelihood it's now being compromised by threat actors and likely being monetized on the dark web, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, and that's where, for example, like taking that security training and making sure it's available to everyone. Know Before is a great example of this. 2 minutes of training here and there keeps that security awareness available and active in the front of their mind all year long. It doesn't don't make it like a 1 2 hour training once a year, because then you're going to just go through the motions and not think about it. But Know Before does a great job of taking that and making it actionable both for their work life and their personal life. And that allows them to take that security culture everywhere and better protects the organization and the individual.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with security awareness. I think there's another aspect to it. Know Before is great. They've been partners on my podcast now for they were partners and supporters of the podcast and were great partners for like 3 years, right? So I very much appreciate Know Before, and Kathy and the team there are unbelievable. You're right, but then there's the other aspect beyond Know Before. There's the internal security communication,
Mhm.
your security marketing internally. And if you're in a large organization, you're in a Fortune 100 or 500, you ought to be able to you should budget to have a internal communications marketing person on your team. Someone whose entire role is generating newsletter and messages and customizing the delivery of security priorities to different teams within the organization. Because at
Yeah,
the end of the
absolutely.
day, there's aspects, and when you're in a large enough organization, this is something you can budget for. But I also think this, by the way, might be my next startup, right? Let me create a startup where what do? We customize your communications to your AppSec team, DevOps, you know, marketing, sales, biz dev, finance, etc., and put out really good content um, for them that's customized, that's going to speak their language, that's going to address their priorities, that's really going to kind of allow you to market security effectively within your organization. But I want to go beyond that for just a second, because to me the human element can't be dismissed without backups. And here's what I'm going to explain. When we talk resiliency and when you talk recovery, right? When you look at any framework, backup and restore
Mm.
are on every, there's one general consensus on any framework anywhere: backup and restore, backup and restore, backup and restore.
Testing it, testing your restoration. Like, it's often so overlooked.
A lot of people assume that just because I'm backing it up, it will work. And I can tell you something. I've experienced a lot of events like you have in your career. You go through these, whether a server is failing due to a cyber incident, or whether it's end of life and it decided to crap out for whatever reason. And all of a sudden you go, well, what was on there? What of our backups? How long is it going to take for us to recover? Because the first question that comes from any executive at any time to anyone in cyber or IT: do we have backups? How long before we can get back online? So, do you know in your IR response plan, in your BCDR plan, right? Do you have the time frame it takes on average to restore different functions of the business? Because if you don't have that, and the resources you need to do it, meaning company resources, if I've got to rebuild this environment, I'm going to need 10 people for 10 days, doing 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day to get the system back up and restored. You want it sooner? I don't need 10, I need 20.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be the cost, right? And we're going to need to operate not 10 or 12 hours a day. We're going to need to operate 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. We're going to have to do shifts in order to get this back up and running. Whatever the case may be, if it's not part of your incident response BCDR plan, you're really missing the point there. Really missing the point.
I would say that even for companies that are cloud native, that are using cloud infrastructure, they think just because I have it in a different AWS region or a different Azure region that it will fill over automatically and it will work. No. I've worked in so many organizations where when I asked, have you tested a full failover? They can't say yes. And when they do partial failovers, they realize that the data isn't syncing properly, that the application isn't connected to the WAF properly or something. And when you ask them, okay, let's take it a step further. If you had to fully restore, how long would it take? And oftentimes they can't answer that. Like they're like, well, it takes 2 hours to restore the database. Great. But what about the rest of it? Like the database is one aspect of it, but you have the rest of the connections to your environment, to your VPCs, to your firewalls that you need to reconnect. And oftentimes those are overlooked and not fully tested.
Or calculated as part of the math and recovery. I can, I've got, just as an example, 150 terabytes, worth of data. To recover that, we believe it's going to take us, we're going to be able to do, just for an example, 10 gigs an hour. And so do the math, right? It's going to take us, 3 days to recover the data. Fine, whatever, right? I'm not a math expert, so no one kill me in the comments for math. And so it takes you 3 days to recover the data. Well, in those 3 days, you've got to rebuild the entire environment. When you go through a cyber incident, the one thing that's often, good CISOs communicate this, inexperienced CISOs don't. Bad CISOs don't even think about it. So you've got to rebuild. You've got to approach it with something you and I've talked about for several months now: zero trust.
Yeah.
You've got to rebuild the entire environment from scratch. New firewalls, new routers, new everything. So, one, you're ridding all of your old stuff. Number two, you're replacing it with all new stuff and you're rebuilding it, you're reprogramming it, you're resetting it up, you're looking at your IOCs and TTPs, you're looking at the different vulnerabilities, you're running all of that as you're rebuilding it in order to really have a resilient start to your rebuild before you're even bringing back and restoring the data. Then you've got to check if your backups are viable. And that's something that often people overlook. Well, I've got backups. So are your backups viable? How resilient are your backups? Do you have an AV or an EDR on your backup endpoint? Because if you don't, right, if your backup endpoint is sitting naked because you never put your EDR on there, then you should ask yourself a question. Am I really backing up, or is this just another network that someone's going to be able to access?
Or are you restoring the vulnerability that you just tried to get rid of?
Right.
And then the other thing, like, people don't take into consideration is rebuilding their identity and access management system when they're recreating everything. That's often, oh, now we have to rebuild it, and that adds to time again. And then something that even overlooked before that, when you think of the human aspect, right, is data classification. Do people properly classify the data when they're creating it, when they're working with it? Like, even if it's an older document, you go to it, classify it, do some sort of tagging, figure out some sort of way to be able to prioritize, okay, this is critical data, this is not, so that when you're doing your backups, you're not going to restore your low non-critical data first. You're going to restore your critical data first, your critical applications first, and then all the rest else is the long tail that comes after that. You want to focus on getting the business back up and running as quickly as possible.
You know, there's the famous security onion, right? That has all the different layers of security. There's a whole bunch of different versions of it, but always at the very bottom, right there on the corner, it says mission critical, right? And mission critical is a whole slew of assets. It's a whole slew of applications. It's a whole slew of data. And if you don't identify what that is, and if you don't know what it is, and if you don't know what it's going to take to get the business restored, what is mission critical, then unfortunately, and you're trying to do that on the fly while you're working, you're in a world of trouble, right? Like, you're going to set yourself back 2 or 3 days in recovery because the discussion and then the viability become setbacks, right? So you're sitting in a room and people are arguing. The tabletop exercises that go into planning this stuff are really, really important, because when you have the tabletop exercise, and in the tabletop exercise, you go, if these 3 applications went down, what functions would we still have? And if you take a look at the recent ransomware attacks that have been in the news, like the city of Wichita over the last few weeks, right? You can essentially tell that their IT systems was compromised and their city management system was compromised, because their libraries, their payment systems, their kind of main fuel to collect revenue's been compromised, right? And that's where the ransomware hit, because those are all the systems that are offline.
Mhm.
And then you look at the rest of it, you know, it's all still kind of semi-functional in some capacity or another. When the city of Atlanta went through its ransomware attack here back in, I believe it was 2019, 2018,
Mhm.
when the city of Atlanta went through it, was right when Mayor Lance Keisha Bottoms became. Well, one of the people that was helping her from the legal side of this was a gentleman by the name of Roy Hadley. Roy's an attorney for Adams and Reese, and Roy's a very, very smart attorney. One of the systems that got paralyzed was the court system in that ransomware attack, meaning all the digital docket items were gone. And the court had to operate on paper. Now, that didn't only impact the court, that impacted the police officers who would typically go on their laptop, fill the report out, hit send, and it would submit it to booking, and then and it would go directly to the district attorney, and it would go to the court, and a bond would be set automatically, and all. So none of that happened. And there was a significant concern around due process at the time. And
Mm.
so Roy and his team at Adams and Reese, and then David Katz and a whole bunch of really, really smart legal minds were working on this, right? They had to go back to paper. The problem was not a lot of people that were still working in the Fulton County courthouse understood paper. They were all fairly young, paralegals, new people in the system. They had to bring people out of retirement.
Yep.
To help go, well, how did you do this then? Some of the judges, many of the judges remember the paper system, right? But in your backups and restore, in your tabletop exercise, if you had to operate on paper for 2 to 3 weeks, do you know what it would take? Do you know what functions could be done in paper, or what functions could be done on an Excel or a Word doc? Like, seriously, you think it's funny, but you know, I've always had extra laptops in my role as a CISO. I've always had extra laptops that always stayed there that were ready to go in a moment's notice. And if we ever went through an event, we knew we had 10 laptops sitting in our IT closet that we can hand to 10 people in order to keep the business operational and functional. New devices until we clean and forensically examine every single endpoint to make sure it's good, right? And depending on the size of your organization, you can have 50 or 100 sitting there, because that's not really a big budgetary item having them, right? And so you got to have that there, and you've got to be able to have a process that says, if these 4 critical systems went offline, how would we still do it? And in banking, I can tell you, we used to practice with the tellers how to take actual
deposits
and checks on paper. That's literally a training that, at least in the banks I've been a part of, we did as part of our general exercise with the retail stores.
Yep.
If systems were down for whatever reason, let's say internet went out in your area.
Yep.
You still have to be able to do business. So we transcend to paper. And then what do we do with the paper? How does and because of regulatory stuff, if you're doing stuff on paper, you've got to keep carbon copies, and you got to store it, and you got to keep it for 7 years, and all of that. So all of that stuff is there. Does that make sense, Chris? What do you think?
Absolutely. And I think, like, one of the exercises living in Florida that I had to take or be a part of was a hurricane planning exercise, where we actually had a hurricane coming. Our facility housed servers, and we had to sit down, talk about how we're going to take these servers down, how we're going to ensure that they properly shut down, how we ensure that the data that is living there is living off the ground. So if there was 1-2 feet of flooding, that the servers won't be compromised. And that activity really imprinted in my mind how you should really do BCDR exercises, how you should test your backups for resiliency, how you should ensure classification of your systems, like which ones are top priority, which ones are not priority. Like, how do you build up your servers, starting them up from your AD to your application servers, so that when they turn online, they have all the access that they need to function properly again. Because if you turn them up in the wrong order, you're going to have servers that can't log on, and you're going to have to go back to local management. You're going to have to restart, and it's a whole big headache. And I think a lot of people don't take that into consideration. The other thing,
go ahead, finish.
I was going to say, the other thing that I think for a lot of small businesses that they should work with is, if you're working with an MSSP, that their MSSP or MSP, managed service provider, or managed security service provider, can help them with that IR and restore. And if you don't have that, think about getting that ahead of time, because trying to get an IR team launched in the middle of a disaster and getting all the paperwork signed and everything approved and getting bodies available to help you, that's not something you do last minute. That's something you have to plan on, and plan on ahead of time.
Yeah, I'm gonna second and third what you just said, right? You've got to know who your resources are. You've got to plan accordingly, and you've got to be able to effectively deploy it. I want to address one last thing, and that's asset management in this whole thing when we talk about resiliency. If you don't know your assets, you don't know what to recover.
Mm-hmm.
And number one, talk to any CISO in your first 100 days. What are your top 2 priorities? Chris, what are your top 2 priorities?
Understanding how the business functions and how everything from IT to process function works and how I play into that. Because if I don't understand how the business makes money and what's attached to that profit generating system, then I don't know how to prioritize my security, my resiliency, my infrastructure.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that. Sorry. Someone dropped me a really important email while you and I are talking. You know, as security practitioners, we have a thing where stuff that like takes our attention, we have to address it right away. So I'm like, and because I'm not in my studio, I'm like not in my normal setup. Like my mic is on the floor, it's not plugged in, you know, like my mic's on a tripod and not on a, you know, like it's so weird. It's so weird, but my studio's coming along really, really nice. There's like, I think by Tuesday, they'll finish all the construction and everything else that's there, hopefully. And so
Nice.
then I'll spend the next 3-4 days rebuilding it. And there's a whole bunch of fun stuff. All right. We've got a few minutes left here because I know you and I both have a hard stop at the bottom half of the hour. And this is a 30-minute podcast. So, you know, we want to be true to time. So what are some of your takeaways, Chris?
I would say some of my takeaways are some of the top controls to think about: MFA, identity and access management, backups, restores, and then data classification, because those lead to your minimum functionality to start to set up your security and management infrastructure. And if you don't have visibility into all those things, you don't have an effective program.
Yeah, completely agree. I'm gonna push one more thing there. Well, by the way, sorry that dropped. That may have. If you're listening, sorry. I will say this. Take the CIS top 20. Use that as your framework to build resiliency. You do the top 10 correctly, you're going to be really, really resilient. Do the top 20 and you're really in good shape. And if you do that, NIST, MITRE, all of those are operational frameworks. NIST, more governance framework.
Yeah.
MITRE, operational, but security operations, not governance and controls of security, right? And I think that's the difference. Maybe we need to do an episode on frameworks.
Maybe. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, let's do an episode on frameworks. Understand that. That's really, really important. Go do your CIS, establish your basic controls, take those top 5, and I'll repeat those top 5 again so everyone knows them. MFA, multi-factor authentication. We barely touched on it, but really important. Don't use text, use an app. Don't believe me, get Roger Grimes' books, Hacking Multi-Factor Authentication. If you don't have Roger's book, then, you know, resign. Awareness and culture, backups, identity access management, asset management. Get that done. That's it for our show. Chris, great to see you, buddy. Have a great weekend. Everyone, have a great weekend. Chris, final words, buddy. I'll let you sign us off.
Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there, and thank you for creating us.
Yes, thank you very much. Happy Mother's Day to all. Have a great weekend and stay cyber safe.
We love feedback, so make sure to connect with us on social media and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform.